Russia is cracking down on foreign agents, and one of these supposed agents is causing controversy. Moscow is looking likely to shut down the operations of Israel's Jewish agency in the country amid a crackdown on supposed foreign influences as the war with Ukraine grinds on. Whilst Russia have yet to give a reason, it is likely because of the agency's two largest backers, Israel and the US. And with interim Prime Minister Yair Lapid opting for a stronger stance against Russia, the government may be worried about the influence of them. This comes following the chief rabbi of Moscow fleeing the country after refusing to support the war, leading Russian Jews to fear that they may be the next ones to be persecuted, with over 13,000 Russian Jews immigrating to Israel in 2022 alone and thousands more expected. This brings a sense of déjà vu from the last decade, where thousands from France emigrated to the Holy Land amid rising anti-Semitism in the country. So should others follow suit? In this game of political partisanship, are the Jews the ones left out? Are we slipping back 100 years into persecution of Jews? Should the rest of the world Jewry follow the Russian Jewry and come to Israel? And could the country handle this new influx? Are Jews in the diaspora safe?
So let's get to it. Are Jews in the diaspora safe? Dear panelists, you know the rules. You each get 30 seconds to lay out your initial stance on the matter, and we'll pick up the debate right after. So, Emily, please take the lead.
So I think it's very obvious that anti-Semitism has been a growing problem over the last few years. Just in the intro that you described, you mentioned, are we going back 100 years? We don't have to look back 100 years to see that anti-Semitism is rising. We don't even have to look back 30 years to see how anti-Semitism manifested in this same place, in Russia or the USSR. This is a rising problem. It's a rising problem around the world. And even in the last week, we've seen that Jews have been the target in Chile, in the United States, in Russia repeatedly, and in multiple other countries. So to answer the question, are Jews in the diaspora actually safe? The answer is no.
Yeah, anti-Semitism seems to always be trending, unfortunately. Ethan, your take?
Well, it depends in a sense. I'll be talking from a European point of view, but I think that if we see ourselves as Jewish, then yes, we do have an issue in the sense that other people will not really recognize us as something else. So we are kind of everywhere in a sense, but not in a lot of numbers. And we're also seen as very mysterious people. So in a sense, we have to be able to educate ourselves and others, because I believe that ignorance towards Jews always leads into hate. So yes, in a sense, we do need to move forward ourselves, and we are not really on a good track with such. And that is currently the problem that we have. So yes, I believe that we are not in a safe.
And last but definitely not least, Yariv, your take?
The picture is much more complicated. It's not just about anti-Semitism. It's about what Israel is doing and what the Israeli government policy affect the situation of Jews around the world. And for sure that Israel is the solution for many of the problems of the Jewish people, but it's also creates the problem. Because when Israel is making political decision, so we see what happened with Russia. The outcome is that Russia is taking steps that will influence the Jewish community. The same with the West Bank. When Israel is occupying the West Bank, more people are anti-Israeli, and then they are becoming also anti-Jewish.
Yes, Israel being both the problem and the solution. Interesting. And then panelists, please feel free to interact from this point onwards. Let's begin with this specific case. Is the Jewish agency merely an excuse, so to speak, for Russia to revenge, quote unquote, Israel for its policies over the Ukraine? We can't ignore it's a part of, to an extent, a greater trend of Russian attitudes vis-a-vis Israel since the invasion began. Ethan?
I believe that in this case, we also have to talk about the notion of dual loyalty. And we as Jews with one Jewish state, in a sense, we are often really seen as being more loyal to that state than anything else. So we have to be able to educate ourselves and others in the sense of what exactly Israel means to us. Well, love of one notion does not mean the destruction of the other. So I believe it can be used as an excuse for the Jewish agency to be targeted by Russia, but we need to be able to move forward and explain dual loyalty as a whole more concretely.
And Emily, yes, Yariv, please. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely the Russians are using the situation in order to punish Israel and the Jewish agency, but it's deeper than that. I think that many of the Russian people, the Russian leadership are saying why we have an organization inside our country trying to move out brains and talented Russian to immigrate to another country. And still we have to take it also into proportion. We do have flights from Russia to Israel. It will be more difficult for Jewish Russians to make aliyah and to come back to Israel or to come to live in Israel, but it's still possible. We are not going back to the times where Jewish people were stuck in Russia without any opportunity to live. This is not what we are facing.
And if we're
not facing it. We're not facing it now, but it's very likely that if we don't step up, and by the way, I agree with what you said earlier, that we need to do more to educate about this anti-Semitic trope of dual loyalty in the West, in Russia, everywhere in the world. And that's not happened. And because that's not happened, people aren't realizing the warning signs when they're happening. You're correct that the situation isn't the same as the USSR today. But when someone like Natan Sharansky goes on the news and says, I urge Russian Jews to leave now, we know that something is happening. We know that Russia can't be trusted with international treaties, as was demonstrated at the beginning of this show itself, or when it comes to the Jewish community. And so I think that if we aren't wary of that and we don't pay attention to what's happening, it can very, very quickly escalate to that level. And the fact that we've ignored all of these spikes in anti-Semitism in the West and elsewhere in the last 10, 20, 30 years is a very, very alarming thing, because what it's resulted in is a tolerance and a normalization of anti-Semitism, and that shouldn't be happening today.
There's a difference between what's going on in Russia than what's going on in America or in West Europe. Because in America and in West Europe, what we are seeing is a very hard criticism, a legitimate one, against Israel and against the policy of the government of Israel. And even
I'm sorry. Excluding Jews from spaces where you're discussing progressive issues on the basis of the fact that they disagree with Israeli policy, that's not an issue about Israel. That's a form of anti-Semitism today, and we have to acknowledge that.
But you're talking about some specific incident. But when you look at the overall picture is that the Jewish people in Europe and in America are paying the price of the Israeli government policy, mostly toward the Palestinians. And when Israel is promoting occupation, the Jewish people around the world are paying the price because they are being tagged as supporters of Israel, and they are being tagged as people that are responsible to the action of the Israeli government. So we need to take into consideration.
I'm sorry, whether you support or oppose the Israeli government, you are blaming the victim when it comes to the issue of anti-Semitism in the West.
No, I don't think it's only anti-Semitism. I think it's mostly anti-Israeli policy criticism.
Yes, Ethan, please.
Yes, if I can quickly interrupt, I agree with Emily mostly because we have to be able to separate this issue, right, of looking at Israeli policies and the need for people or the desire for people to want to come to Israel, right? We should maybe ask ourselves as well, the Jewish agency, it fits a demand for people. How come there is such a big demand as well for Russian Jews to want to come to Israel in the first place? It's not suddenly that it appeared out of nowhere and that the Jewish agency specifically pushes propaganda for Russian Jews to be able to come to Israel. So we need to look at the why before we can talk about the rest of the issue.
But it is important to note, dear panelists, that the Jewish Agency is not an Israeli organization. It is not a part of the governmental mechanism in this sense. So perhaps Israel is somewhat picking up a diplomatic spat when we're talking about a technical or a bureaucratic or a legal matter here. Obviously, Russia is perhaps trying to capitalize on that, but maybe Jerusalem falls into this trap?
I don't think they're falling into...
Please, Emily.
I don't think they're falling into any kind of trap on this issue. I do think that this is what Russia intended, but it's also important to note that the Jewish Agency isn't the only Jewish organization that's been targeted.
Right.
There are many other Jewish organizations that have received notices that they're to cease all activity, potentially being dissolved, and many of them have some form of foreign funding. I don't think that the claim of Russia that this is just an issue of tracking down or keeping track of foreign agents, I think that this dual loyalty trope that Jews, somehow Russian Jews are foreign agents or that they have dual loyalties is anti-Semitic in and of itself. And we haven't done our job, quite frankly, on educating about what anti-Semitism looks like today, on what modern anti-Semitism looks like. And I think that this is the biggest shortcoming when it comes to this issue. I don't think we should conflate any of these issues about, oh, well, it's a modern political issue, it's not related. It is related. It's something we've seen over and over and over and over again throughout history. This is modern anti-Semitism.
So
I think
yes.
What we did was counterproductive, because every time that was criticism against Israel or even targeting Jewish foreigners around the world, Jewish that are not Israelis around the world, saying that this criticism against them, it's anti-Semite, when we are using the anti-Semitic terms too many times, even when it's a legitimate criticism, then when we have a real clear-cut case like we are having now, that it's anti-Israeli that translate to anti-Jewish, then no one will want to listen. And I do think that what we did in the last few years was to make the term anti-Semitic something that is under dispute. And this was a mistake by Netanyahu, by the government, the right-wing government, using the word anti-Semite in order to move out any legitimate criticism about Israel and about Israel's decision on other issues.
Ethan, is it the boy who cried wolf? Are we too quick, perhaps, to flag the anti-Semitic, to raise, rather, the anti-Semitic flag this time around? It might be just plain geopolitics considerations?
I think as a whole, like, honestly, yes, I do agree in the sense that we've been using anti-Semitic or anti-Semitism as a card a bit too freely. But because we don't give enough context to it, we often cry anti-Semitism without explaining why exactly it can be considered as anti-Semitism. And I don't really agree that everything that, every time that anti-Semitism has been declared by the state of Israel, that it is just a way to, like, whitewash everything that's happening. No, it shouldn't really be regarded that way. We need to be able to explain exactly how it is. And by, for example, Russia now taking the step to, like, ban the Jewish agency, or at least wanting to remove some of its operational parts with other organizations, it definitely feeds onto the already existing notion of anti-Semitism or the existence of anti-Semitism in Russian society as a whole. So it feeds into it. And there isn't really much elaboration from the Russian government either, besides what we already know right now. So if there was maybe some other elaboration, we can maybe look especially a bit more deeper into yes or no, if it is really deep anti-Semitism or not. But at the current moment, I believe that, yes, it can be considered anti-Semitism because it feeds into already pre-existing notion. And it's not, in my opinion, not at all something that only regards Israel and the position of the Russian-Ukrainian war.
Yes,
not only that, but it's also holding the local Jewish population accountable for issues that may or may not have anything to do with them. That's what they're doing. They're holding their own Jewish community accountable, and it's the same trend that we've seen on other issues when it comes to Israeli policy in the United States. And to say that the problem here is Israeli policy is inaccurate. The problem here is that not anti-Semitism is overused, but that anti-Zionism
Emily, we'll
is used.
put a stop right there because we're taking a very short break, but we pick up the debate from that point exactly. Before we dive back into the debate, as Emily mentioned earlier, Nathan Sharansky told I-24 News earlier in the day that he's calling on all Jews to leave Russia immediately before it gets too late. So let's take a quick listen to some of those who already did a big move immigrating from Russia to Israel, and we'll pick up the conversation right after.
I think it is blackmail, so Israeli government won't state its position on Ukraine. And through the Jewish agency, they are trying to affect the position of Israeli diplomats. Without the help of the Jewish agency, people also can leave. There still will be an option of immigrating in the airport. So in this case, the Jewish agency is actually an extra link.
I think this could be a push for immigration to Israel in the near future, but at the same time, it can slow down this process later on. I mean, when it comes to legal questions.
I've seen the news, and it is a great pity. I hope they'll find an option to help people without any connection to this situation. Maybe it's a temporary decision, and even if it goes to court and someone wins a case, it could be appealed in such a way to gain some time to help people immigrate to Israel in a calm frame of mind. There are many people who have already immigrated. They come to Israel and pay for the tickets themselves. We are lucky to do it calmly.
So let's get started this part of the debate with another 30-second round each. And dear panelists, my question to you, let it be this or that reason. Is the Russia feud with Israel is a proof of sorts that the Jews are always the go-to target to an extent? Ethan.
I think as a whole, in Russia, we should know that the Jewish community is quite large. And honestly, they have made their way quite successful into, I guess, society as a whole. And here comes again the whole notion that Emily and I were talking about dual loyalty. We are always accused of dual loyalty. And in this case, it is very easy to just go to that one people or that one group, because, yes, there is only one Jewish state. So once again, that is something that we need to educate about and need to understand as well in the Russian context.
Yariv, your take?
Jewish around the world, whether they like it or not, they are connected to Israel, even if they decided not to come to live here. Therefore, the action of the state of Israel has an effect on their situation. And in an extreme situation, it becomes anti-Semite, and people are going to suffer from it. It's not news that Russia is not democracy. And Russia is not democracy not only toward Jews, also toward other communities and toward the media, every people that would try to criticize the government. So Jews are there and they are a target, but it's an outcome of the policy of the government of Israel.
Last but not least, Emily, your opinion?
So I don't think that Jews are necessarily the first, but we have seen throughout history that they are one of the first groups to be targeted by different countries all over the world of different religions and different backgrounds. So this is a serious cause for concern. And I just wanted to add one note. Jews were targeted by these countries before the state of Israel existed. Jews were scapegoated throughout human history. So to claim that it's a result or a byproduct of the actions of the state of Israel is simply inaccurate.
And let's feel free to interact from this point onwards. And as Yariv mentioned, there are obviously many flaws or criticism when it comes to Russian values as a state, let's put it that way. But this is not the case in France, for example. And as our senior producer Joe Brown mentioned in the report, it does bring some sort of a deja vu type of a feeling when we've seen this wave of immigration from France to Israel because of grassroots anti-Semitism there. So do you see the dots getting connected here, or are we talking about two different cases, two separate communities, and two sets of circumstances to an extent?
I do feel it's a separate cases, and in France, what we saw is that you got a bigger Muslim community that totally support the Palestinian cause, and therefore the Jewish community are paying the price. And we saw the rise of the extreme right wing, especially in America when Trump was in power, but also in East Europe, and there are really a new neo-Nazi parties that Israeli government made connections because we are sharing the same enemy, the Palestinian or the Muslim people. So Israel, unfortunately, is not always thinking just about anti-Semites, thinking also about the interest of the government. And when the interest of the government is to go with the far right, even if they have very bad reputation and very negative position toward immigrants and Jewish, still Israeli, part of the Israeli leadership, made connection with them. So it's mostly about policy, and yes, the Israeli government policy has an effect on the situation of Jewish people around the world.
I really want to know, is there anything that you won't blame on Israel? Is there any anti-Semitism around the world that somehow you don't see as related to Israel? And how do you explain the fact that prior to the state of Israel, these same trends, the same tropes about Jews were peddled throughout history from governments, from leaders? Or is everything Israel to you? Because you're giving a free pass to those who are normalizing anti-Semitism on the right, on the left, from Islamic extremists, from any direction where anti-Semitism is coming. You're giving them a free pass by your response being, oh, well, it's because of the state of Israel. It's because of the state of Israel. I disagree with many Israeli policies, many, and I've written about them and I've spoken about them extensively. But to claim that anti-Semitism and the normalization of hate and using the terms anti-Zionism as somehow that's better than anti-Semitism today, how people are using this around the world is inexcusable. And it has nothing to do with Israel's policies.
You can be angry on me, but I'm telling you that as long as the policy of the state of Israel will be, for example, to ignore the the basic rights of the Palestinian people. So the real anti-Semites...
They aren't protesting at my former university at USC. They aren't writing "curse the Jews" as the student leaders are writing on Twitter because they oppose Israeli policy. They're writing it because they hate Jews. They're writing it because they have a problem with Jewish students, with people who support the right of the state of Israel to exist.
So
not one state, two state. They're not debating that. They're debating the existence of the state of Israel and whether or not it has a right to exist. That should be off the table. Even debating that is something anti-Semitic.
Let me be clear. There are anti-Semitic organization, people, even leaders around the world. That's true. And these people that are also my enemy, they are using the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the occupation in order to gain more support. And yes, people are becoming less and less sympathetic to Israel, to the idea of Israel. And because Israel considers itself to represent the Jewish people, so also less sympathetic to the Jewish people. Because what we are doing, you can be very, very right, but you have to be smart in order to make it change. And if we will not change the policy of the state of Israel, so these cases will be on a rise every year.
Let me tell you something. The people who are flying SS flags in Florida...
Ethan.
Sorry, if you don't mind, again, I'll add my 2 cents on this because I was raised as somebody Jewish in Europe. I do not know if that's the case for both of you, but I heavily agree in a sense with what Emily said, that not everything can just be blamed on Israel like that. For example, in this case, a lot of it, from what in my own experience, has been a lot about ignorance. When somebody says that they love the idea of Israel, or when somebody associates themselves as Jewish with the notion of Israel, there's an enormous misconception that when you say that you support or love Israel, that you support everything that's politics related. You have no idea to which extent people agree or disagree about it, but we still definitely feel something for Israel inside. So I think, again, ignorance is really at the root of all of this in a sense. And we need as well to make our, to inform our own community and to inform others about this. That is the root of the issue. More in Europe than the United States, according to the ADL. You have dual loyalty accusations. You have more things about classical blood libels, a bit of everything. So I think that we need to fix those issues first before we can actually move on and talk about going to Israel. We need to be able to go to Israel out of pride, not out of fear, and leave behind 1,000, 2,000 years of contribution that we made on this continent in the European context. So no, I do not believe that these communities are the same. We can make a comparison between France, Russia, Sweden, Germany, etc. We can simply not do that. There is no such thing as European Jew. Every community is distinct, and we need to be able to ensure that there's a continuation of such and to not always link it to Israel, because that is very useless. We need to again be able to discharge or take that idea apart, because last thing as well, yes, we have this dual loyalty accusation as talked before, and as Emily has said before Israel, there have been different types of dual loyalty, as we have never been loyal citizens as a whole to any country. It's always to our own community or some kind of other mysterious kind of
Kabbalah. Dear panelists, we're out of time, definitely not out of passion. Emily Schrader, Ethan Bergman, and Yariv Oppenheimer, I cannot thank you enough for joining us today. Hopefully we will see you again on the show soon.